Welcome to the Bare Metal Cyber C-Risk Prepcast. This series helps you prepare for the exam with focused explanations and practical context. Domain 3 is where risk management becomes operational. In other words, this is where everything from Domain 1 and Domain 2 gets implemented and tracked. The focus here is on selecting the right response, planning its execution, assigning ownership, and monitoring the outcomes. In other words, Domain 3 is about doing, not just deciding. This domain closes the loop between governance and day-to-day decision-making. In other words, it connects policy to real action. On the C-Risk exam, Domain 3 questions usually ask you to make decisions and justify them based on context, risk posture, and governance policy. In other words, your answers must reflect judgment, not just knowledge. Expect scenario-based questions that test whether you know who is responsible, what action is appropriate, and how success should be validated. In other words, exam success depends on seeing the full cycle. If you think of Domain 1 as defining risk and Domain 2 as evaluating risk, then Domain 3 is the part that delivers actual risk response. In other words, Domain 3 brings risk to resolution. To master Domain 3, you must know the 4 risk response options and when to apply them. In other words, every scenario leads to one of 4 choices. Acceptance is appropriate when the residual risk is within tolerance and the decision is formally documented. In other words, governance approved doing nothing further. Mitigation requires implementing controls that target either impact or likelihood reduction. In other words, mitigation adds defenses. Transfer means shifting risk contractually through insurance, outsourcing, or indemnification. In other words, someone else absorbs the impact. Avoidance means exiting the activity or exposure entirely. In other words, stop doing what creates the risk. Every response must align with the organization's appetite, available resources, and operational feasibility. In other words, don't choose what sounds best, choose what fits. The right answer on the exam isn't always the strongest sounding. It's the one that fits the business context. In other words, match risk response to real-world constraints. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other podcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Treatment planning is where risk response becomes a project. In other words, it's where strategy turns into a task list. A solid treatment plan includes the chosen strategy, the specific actions and controls to be implemented, a timeline with milestones, and expected residual risk. In other words, it shows what will be done, by whom, and by when. It must also list owners for each action and budget considerations if resources are required. In other words, responsibility and cost must be clear. Failures in treatment often occur when the plan is missing detail, sequencing is flawed, or no validation step is built in. In other words, plans fail if they are incomplete, out of order, or untested. In C-risk scenarios, the right answer typically includes visibility, accountability, and traceability. In other words, good treatment plans are fully mapped and fully owned. Ownership is critical in Domain 3. In other words, knowing who is responsible is half the answer. Risk owners are accountable for exposure, they make decisions, accept risk, or request further treatment. In other words, they are the strategic decision makers. Control owners are accountable for implementation and operation. They make sure controls are deployed, tested, and working. In other words, they handle the execution. Use RACI models to clarify who is responsible, who must approve, and who must be consulted or informed. In other words, clarity avoids duplication or confusion. On the exam, scenarios involving failure often include misassigned roles or unowned decisions. In other words, failures are often caused by unclear ownership. The best answers reflect alignment between role, responsibility, and risk context. In other words, the right people doing the right thing. Third-party risk requires active management. In other words, outsourcing the work does not outsource the risk. Before onboarding any vendor or external party, evaluate their controls, contract terms, and risk profile. In other words, due diligence protects your organization. Use SLAs, audit rights, and contractual clauses to maintain oversight. In other words, write accountability into the agreement. Monitor third-party KRIs and track exceptions, breaches, or non-compliance. In other words, keep watch even after handoff. Scenarios often involve vendors who are not reassessed or controls that degraded over time. In other words, risk increases when oversight stops. Remember, even when the service is external, the risk stays internal. In other words, your reputation and exposure are still on the line. Issue, exception, and finding management is another high-frequency exam topic in Domain 3. In other words, you must know what to do when controls fail. Issues are deviations from expected performance, findings are audit-verified failures, and exceptions are formally approved deviations from policy. In other words, issues signal gaps, findings confirm them, and exceptions legitimize them. Every one of these must be tracked, assigned, and closed through documented validation. In other words, follow-through matters. Exceptions must include expiration dates and compensating controls. In other words, they should not be open-ended. Findings must be acknowledged, responded to, and retested before closure. In other words, resolution must be confirmed. C-risk professionals must ensure that governance reviews unresolved issues and that nothing is buried or bypassed. In other words, transparency equals accountability. Domain 3 is also where you must clearly distinguish between KRIs, KCIs, and KPIs. In other words, know what each metric tells you. KRIs are about risk exposure. Think leading indicators like failed logins or policy exceptions. In other words, KRIs say risk is rising. KCIs are about control health. Think metrics like patch rates or access review completion. In other words, KCIs show if safeguards are working. KPIs are about business performance, like response times or SLA fulfillment. In other words, KPIs measure output and efficiency. The best answers use the right metric for the right purpose and always include thresholds, owners, and escalation logic. In other words, maturity means measurement with meaning. Reporting is a decision tool, not just a compliance activity. In other words, it's meant to support governance, not just check a box. Use heat maps to summarize risk posture by impact and likelihood. In other words, color makes risk clear. Scorecards track treatment plan progress, trends, and ownership. In other words, they show movement and accountability. Dashboards are interactive views for real-time control and risk performance. In other words, they bring metrics to life. Tailor reports to the audience. Executives, risk committees, and control owners need different levels of detail. In other words, fit report to role. When a scenario mentions leadership missing something, the root cause is usually poor reporting design or cadence. In other words, when reports fail, monitoring and continuous improvement complete the Domain 3 life cycle. In other words, it's never just implement and walk away. Controls degrade over time, and responses may lose alignment with the current threat landscape. In other words, what worked last year may fail now. Use audits, control tests, KCI trends, and incident reviews to spot weaknesses. In other words, look for signals that it's time to adjust. Update treatment strategies and the risk register when indicators shift. In other words, the response must evolve with the environment. On the exam, the best answers close the loop between what was planned and what was learned. In other words, iteration is excellence. Domain 3 exam questions require careful reading. In other words, they test nuance, not just memorization. Ask yourself, am I being asked to select a response, assign an owner, report performance, or validate success? In other words, match the verb to the right step. Pay attention to timing. Some questions ask what happens before treatment, during implementation, or after monitoring. In other words, identify where you are in the process. Eliminate answers that ignore governance, misalign roles, or contradict business feasibility. In other words, rule out what doesn't make sense in practice. You're not just answering for theory, you're proving how well you manage response, performance, and change. In other words, you are applying risk thinking in motion. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Bare Metal Cyber C-Risk Prepcast. For more episodes, tools, and study support, visit us at baremetalcyber.com.